Even though Final Fantasy has seen numerous summons associated with the ice element over the years, none have had quite the same impact and longevity as Shiva. Often appearing as the antithesis of Ifrit, Shiva would use her quintessential diamond dust finishing move to punish enemies who weren't all that keen on the cold. But over the years, due to how many games Shiva has graced with her presence, there has been a fair bit of deviation, and it's seen numerous moves added to her arsenal. And such has been the reverence developers have had for Shiva, that they have still found ways to include her, even if the wider gameplay mechanics did not include ice within the list of featured elements. Throughout this video, we're going to take you on an expansive journey as we explore how every single appearance of Shiva has tied together to create something of legend.
Oh, Saint Shiva, still the hatred within our hearts and bless us with eternal grace.
Unlike many of the other prominent summons to have graced the Final Fantasy franchise, the origins of Shiva are not all that clear. Due to the identical name, there could be an association with the Hindu god of destruction, but although there are some female representations of this Shiva, it is often portrayed as a man, and there is no connection with the ice element. Likewise, other connections have been made with the Queen of Sheba due to similarities in how it would be pronounced, but outside of a similar sounding name and correct gender, there again was no affinity with ice. Other theories are a bit more literal, as Shiva is how Japanese speakers would say Shiva, and in certain dialects native to Tohoku and Hokkaido, Chibare also means cold. Either way, Shiva first appeared in Final Fantasy III as a summonable entity, and she was associated with the ice element. The spell could be purchased from either a magic shop in Repleto or from Doga's village, but due to the nature of the game, Shiva could be summoned by either summoners, evokers or sages, and there were 3 potential spells and 3 potential Shivas. The colour palettes had quite a lot of variety, with mixtures of orange, green, blue and purple found across her hair, skin and general attire. These then corresponded to the selection of moves, with evokers able to call forth Shiva to use either Hypnotic Ray or Mesmerize as it was called in the DS remake, which would inflict sleep, or Icy Stare, which would deal ice damage to one enemy. Summoners and sages could then use Shiva to perform Diamond Dust, which would deal ice damage to all enemies. These many traits provided a solid foundation, but in reality, it was quite a muted appearance as Shiva was weak in comparison to other summons and would often be overlooked in favour of using Odin, Leviathan and Bahamut. In Final Fantasy IV, Shiva would be one of the summons available to Rydia when she returned to the party, and this again denoted her as a low-tier summon. From a visual perspective, the design of Shiva was similar to the previous game, with short hair and a cape, but for some reason heels were added. The colour palette also served as an amalgamation, with greens, blues and purples present across various elements. When called upon, Shiva would perform an unnamed move that would deal ice damage to all enemies, but even though the damage output was weak again in comparison to some of the stronger summons, Final Fantasy IV provided a lot more application due to there being numerous ice-weak enemies. Final Fantasy V returned to the job class system, and Shiva appeared again as one of the low-tier summons alongside Ramuh and Ifrit. But this time, despite only being a level 2 summon, Shiva could still provide a lot of utility thanks to her Diamond Dust move, especially when paired with the Ice Rod, as her strength was higher than Blizzara and the MP cost was the same. This would come into play early on, as if Shiva was acquired before the fight against Ifrit in Castle Walsei, the fight would be made much easier. And this small optional side quest also provided some lore, as Shiva wasn't just a random being, she was known to NPCs and she was referred to as a goddess. It also acted as a deviation on multiple accounts, as not only was it the first occurrence of a fight against Shiva, with a player needing to prove their strength in order to obtain her, she fought alongside minions, and her appearance was monochrome, with shades of purple being used. The connection with lore was built upon for Shiva's appearance in Final Fantasy VI, as she appeared alongside Ifrit in the Magitech research facility. It's believed Shiva formed the basis for Celes' infusion into becoming a Magitech Knight, but after being weakened by continued experimentation, Kefka chose to discard the now weakened Esper into the garbage chute alongside Ifrit. Being encountered by the party not too long after, both were beaten down to the point that they lashed out in what was presumed to be self-defense, leading to a boss encounter. It was only once they sensed the presence of Ramuh, the summon who had been grouped with them in Final Fantasy IV and V, that they came to their senses, offering to aid the party. During the encounter, Shiva would appear with green hair, a blue-toned body and purple attire, another amalgamation of the multiple colour palettes seen in Final Fantasy III, but unlike previous versions, Shiva was now naked aside from a piece of cloth. When called upon, she would use Diamond Dust, a move that would deal moderate ice damage to all enemies, but her main application was in teaching Rasp and Osmose as a Magicite. Final Fantasy VII saw the connection between Shiva, Ifrit and Ramuh retained, but it was much softer, as alongside CHOCOBO'S and Titan, they each provided identical stat changes to the party member they were equipped to, something that denoted their low tiering. Unlike previous games, Shiva was no longer learnt, bought or acquired after showing strength. Instead, the materia was rewarded from Priscilla for defeating another enemy called Bottom Swell. After being equipped and then summoned, players would see an evolution of the design from Final Fantasy VI, with long hair in a ponytail and small garments added to compensate for the use of a 3D model. They would also see Shiva use Diamond Dust to deal moderate ice damage. This iteration of Shiva would then be faithfully brought back in Before Crisis, but unlike Ifrit, Shiva did not appear in Crisis Core. Shiva would next appear in Final Fantasy Tactics, where she could only be used by summoners after being learnt by spending 200 JP. When called upon, Shiva would perform an ice-based attack, but it now had a different name, referred to as Glacial Shards, and although it would still attack multiple foes, it would only affect those within the designated area, as opposed to every enemy on the battlefield. Shiva also featured a very different design, and the colour palette focused more on greens, purples and even oranges, as opposed to anything blue. To continue the theme of design deviation, CHOCOBO'S Mystery Dungeon featured a more cutesy version of Shiva, who wore a lot more clothing than any previous version. There was also a heavy emphasis on blue, with varying shades used, and the long hair returned from Final Fantasy VII, complete with ponytail. The method of summoning Shiva was also changed, as the player could now do so by using a Shiva Spirit Stone, and this would see an ice elemental attack performed, called Diamond Dust. For its sequel, the designers decided to double down and make Shiva even cuter. Upon being summoned, again by using a Shiva Spirit Stone, Shiva would appear holding a chocobo, and she now wore a white dress, the first appearance of this colour in association with Shiva. She also wore visible jewellery. Outside of Diamond Dust, another interesting addition to Shiva's repertoire was a second move called Slap. This would be performed if Shiva was summoned using a feather. This version of Shiva then made an appearance in Chocobo Racing, as well as in Final Fantasy Fable's Chocobo's Tales, where Shiva was given a more specific focus, starring in one of the chapters. It was called Shiva and Ifrit, and it would act as a Final Fantasy version of the classic fable from Aesop called The North Wind and the Sun. In Final Fantasy VIII, Shiva could be acquired right at the start of the game from a classroom inside Balamb Garden, and if used against Ifrit during the boss encounter that took place not too long after, it would draw a comment, showing a loose connection between the two. They would also be the antithesis of each other, having opposite compatibility from a junctioning perspective, but although anyone could be junctioned to Shiva, she had the strongest compatibility with Quistis and Rinoa. Her appearance was quite different from anything that had come before, featuring strong yellow hair with blue and green highlights alongside an icy skin colour. For the most part, she appeared naked, but various purple patches were placed around delicate areas, and her hands and feet featured a light to dark blue gradient. When summoned, Shiva would perform Diamond Dust to attack all enemies with ice damage, but her usefulness outside of the fight against Ifrit was more related to what she could offer from a junctioning perspective, as opposed to what she could offer in combat. Now, up until this point in the franchise, Shiva had been given small snippets of focus within the lore of the main games, but there had never been anything too substantial. That all changed with Final Fantasy IX thanks to some notes that could be found on the Eidolon wall in Madain Sari. Here we got to learn that Shiva was the first Eidolon discovered by the summoners, and although in the modern timeline she was a grown woman, back then, when she was discovered, she took the form of a small child. In her adult form, Shiva was quite similar to what was seen in Final Fantasy VIII, with pale skin and a variety of blue tones used on her hands and feet, as well as her underwear. But her hair was no longer yellow, reverting back to blue. This Shiva also had a crown, an interesting touch that played on her infrequent description as the Ice Queen. From a gameplay perspective, Shiva was associated with Garnet and was available to the player at the start of the game, but unless the player chose to grind, it would never be possible to use due to the high MP cost. It was only later that Shiva could be summoned after obtaining an opal, and this would see the classic diamond dust used to deal ice damage to all enemies. In Final Fantasy X, Shiva was again associated with a summoner, and Yuna could gain access after praying to the faith at Macalania Temple. As with the previous game, there was also a small piece of lore that went along with its appearance, as within the Ultimania, it was revealed that prior to becoming a faith, she was a priestess at Macalania Temple called Sylvia. Due to the evolved gameplay mechanics, whereby Aeons would be playable characters when called upon, we got to see a slight expansion to Shiva's toolkit, as alongside Diamond Dust, her overdrive that would deal ice damage to all enemies, she also had a kick as a standard melee attack and a move called Heavenly Strike. This was a non-elemental physical attack that would add a status effect, a trait that had not been associated with Shiva since Final Fantasy III. Outside of this, Shiva had a similar appearance, with pale skin and various darker tones used across her feet and body. She also wore minimal undergarments, but there was now much more focus placed on her hair, which had huge braids, as well as some jewellery. In the international version of Final Fantasy X, we also saw the first variant of Shiva known as Dark Shiva. She reverted back to the green colour variant of Shiva seen in Final Fantasy III, albeit with a darker tone. It was also much tougher, with many of the various moves upgraded, including Heavenly Strike, which could now inflict instant death, berserk, and confuse. Dark Shiva would then reappear in Final Fantasy X-2 as a much weaker variant, but Shiva's next major appearance was in Final Fantasy Unlimited, and it was unlike anything seen before, as even though there were vague parts that resembled a humanoid figure, for the most part, Shiva was a crystalline being that was much more abstract.
So cold! You're a tricky one! I had no idea you would make things so cold!
Final Fantasy XI then continued the theme of including backstory around Shiva, and for this particular iteration, we learnt that she was once an intelligent young queen who ruled over a small kingdom to the south of Vana'diel. But despite being a respected ruler, Shiva's uncle managed to organise a coup, seizing the throne and banishing the young queen to live in isolation in the frozen Northlands, something that led to her freezing to death. Moved by the plight of the young queen, the goddess Altana decided to transform Shiva into the celestial avatar of ice. Shiva could first be encountered during Trial by Ice, where she was known as Shiva Prime, and her appearance was similar to the previous couple of mainline games. It would see Shiva feature a monochrome colour scheme with a purple base, and darker tones would be used for her hand, feet, hair and cape, as well as the patterns that adorned her body. In the encounter itself, and when summoned afterwards, upon successfully completing Trial by Ice, Shiva's moveset would pull from a variety of sources. Axe Kick, for example, served as a loose reference to the melee attack in Final Fantasy X. Double Slap evolved the move seen in CHOCOBO'S Dungeon 2, Heavenly Strike was adjusted to be an ice-based elemental spell, and she could cast Sleepgar, a nod to Hypnotic Ray from Final Fantasy III. There were also two new moves, Diamond Storm and Crystal Blessing. The former would reduce the evasion of enemies in the target area, and the latter would grant a TP boost to party members. And then there was Diamond Dust, the special move that would deal massive ice damage to those within the area of effect. When coupled with the ability to fight against various iterations of Shiva Prime, it made this particular appearance of Shiva very impactful in the immediate sense, but very few of the traits introduced would end up permeating into the franchise as it continued to build out. Final Fantasy Tactics, for example, featured a design unlike anything ever seen before, as Shiva wore full armour that had hints of blue and green across its plating. She was also given a new method of acquisition, as summoners would need to learn the ability to call upon Shiva from the Snake Staff, but when called upon, the attack was quite standard, as it would deal ice-based damage to a specific target area. This new iteration of Shiva was then used across future related properties, including Tactics A2, Crystal Defenders and Tactics S, with the only deviation of note being that in Crystal Defenders and Tactics S, Shiva appeared as a boss. Shiva would next appear as part of additional content added to Final Fantasy IV Advance. Featured during Rydia's tale in the Lunar Ruins, Shiva would be fought twice as a boss. For the mandatory fight, she featured a yellow strand of hair, a trait introduced in the original Tactics, and yellow was also added to her attire, something never seen before. But the developers took this notion further by introducing a variant called Lunar Shiva, who would have a much stronger association with yellow and would appear as an optional boss. Both would be able to use a move called Ice Storm that would deal high amounts of ice damage to the entire party based on Shiva's current HP, as well as a lesser variant called Frost Blast. As Final Fantasy XII deviated away from using traditional espers in favour of those more deep-rooted in Ivalice, it did not feature Shiva in the traditional sense. but there was still an ode, as a light cruiser in the 8th Imperial Fleet was named the Shiva. This was followed up by Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, which did not only feature Shiva, but a few variants as well. The traditional version of Shiva appeared as a Tier 3 ranged summon, and when encountered, she wore a green bikini with blue-coloured accessories. She also had a more human-looking skin tone as opposed to a shade of blue, green or purple. As there was no official classification of ice elemental summons, we also got to see another interesting deviation, as Shiva was classified as a water-related summon. In spite of this, Shiva was still weak to fire as opposed to being weak to thunder like the other water-related summons. Her standard attack evolved Slap further, as instead of it being a single slap or even a double slap, it was now triple slap. Diamond Dust then saw its first major evolution, as it not only dealt water-based damage as opposed to ice, but inflicted Stop, which acted as a merging of previous traits that would see Shiva use status effects like Sleep. Outside of Shiva, 2 lesser variants could also be fought against and acquired: Shivan, known as Baby Shiva in the Japanese version, and Shiva, known as Darling Shiva, which was a male variant. They would each use water-based moves, with Shiva introducing a new move called Absolute Zero, which would inflict Stop on a single target. Dissidia Final Fantasy referenced both the Final Fantasy IV and VIII versions of Shiva, and they could be found in the Destiny Odyssey 2 storyline. When called upon, she would freeze the opponent's bravery points, preventing them from being increased when performing bravery attacks. And in its sequel, these 2 summons performed the same role. However, due to the addition of Yuna, Shiva from Final Fantasy X was also added to the equation, able to perform Heavenly Strike and Diamond Dust. Final Fantasy XIII featured perhaps one of the most unique appearances of Shiva, as it was no longer an individual. Instead, Shiva consisted of 2 ice-fused mechanical women called Styria and Nyx, who, when combined, would merge into a motorcycle. Each featured similar colour palettes, but there was a significant deviation from colours used in the past, with white and gold now much more prominent, as well as a darker blue. As they were mechanical, they didn't have hair in the traditional sense, but both did still wear crowns that matched their individual colour palettes. They would be fought as part of the story, and Snow would gain the ability to call upon them after overcoming the challenge. But if summoned, outside of specific ice-based spells, there was nothing inherently drawn from the rest of the franchise, as many of their individual moves related to their ability to double up as a bike. The only exception was Diamond Dust, which would deal ice damage to all targets and could be initiated from the Gestalt mode. Returning to a more traditional style, Shiva appeared in Final Fantasy Dimensions as a boss in Act 2 of the story. Her design was inspired by Final Fantasy III and IV, with Shiva wearing heels, having short hair, and a colour palette that consisted of greens, blues, and purples. During the encounter, Shiva would use Diamond Dust to deal ice elemental damage to every target, and that same move could be used by the player when summoning her. Shiva appeared in Final Fantasy XIV as part of patch 2.4, known as Dreams of Ice, and she did so as an antagonist. It would see the Warrior of Light tasked with defeating Shiva, after it had become connected with the body of Lady Iceheart, and this would see her adopt a rather grandiose appearance that used various hues of blue, with green and purple used for her cape. We also got to see the return of an armoured Shiva, with her also wearing a spiked crown. In the initial encounter, Shiva would make use of numerous moves that would serve as throwbacks to many games throughout the history of the franchise, including Heavenly Strike, which would also inflict knockback, and Absolute Zero, which would deal damage to all targets. But there was a twist, as Shiva would now use a weapon, and the moves used throughout the encounter would depend on whether she was in sword, staff, or bow stance. Shiva could also summon ice warriors, an interesting nod back to Final Fantasy V. Outside of that, Shiva also had a few new moves, such as Dreams of Ice, which would be a permanent stackable buff that would deal increased damage over time, and Icicle Impact, an area of effect attack that would add a vulnerability debuff. Another move was Whiteout, which would deal damage to those at longer range, as well as Hailstorm and Avalanche, and these would lead up to the casting of Diamond Dust, which would deal considerable damage and wipe the party if the aforementioned Ice Warriors had not been dealt with before its casting. In addition to this encounter, Extreme and Unreal versions could also be faced, and an alternative version of Shiva appeared in Shadowbringers, where Rin acted as a vessel for Shiva's spirit. Final Fantasy Type 0 included Shiva within its roster of Eidolons, with there being 3 types of Shiva class Eidolon available to the player, each offering different abilities. They were spread across Shiva, Petite Shiva, and Shankara, which was an interesting choice as it related back to one of the potential sources of inspiration, and that's because Adi Shankara was an Indian philosopher who considered himself to be the incarnation of the Hindu god, Shiva. Each would have a more human appearance, would wear black clothing, and would use a variety of moves, including the traditional diamond dust, which could now have its output enhanced through player interaction. Shiva's appearance in Record Keeper was much the same as in Dissidia, as previous versions were brought forth, including Final Fantasy V and VIII. Some of them appeared as allies to the player, while others, such as the Shiva sisters and Dark Shiva, appeared as enemies. It was also possible for the players to summon specific iterations of Shiva through their soul breaks, further adding to the amount of variety, but there was nothing present that furthered the evolution of Shiva. In Final Fantasy Explorers, Shiva appeared as one of the main antagonists, and her defeat served as a milestone the players would need to overcome. She featured an interesting design that saw yellow hair return, with various hues of purple used across the rest of her outfit. There was also a metallic frame on her back. Throughout the fight, she would use numerous ice-based moves, with diamond dust acting as the main source of worry, and after being defeated, players could then wield the power of Shiva as a crystal surge. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 deviated a lot from its predecessor, and this ended up having a significant impact on how Shiva would be represented. In the initial sense, even though Shiva appeared during a quest called Ice Princess Shiva, she was a water elemental. This was similar to Revenant Wings, and it meant diamond dust would again deal water elemental damage to enemies as opposed to ice. Perhaps because of this, Shiva had a design that made her look more like a mermaid. She again had minimal clothing, with darker colouring on her hands and feet, as well as a crown, but the colour was now greeny blue as opposed to blue or green. Alongside this version of Shiva, there were also many other forms. For example, in one of her sprites as an enemy, Shiva had a more human-coloured skin colour and wore a dress, as well as wielding a bow, a potential nod to Final Fantasy XIV. Alongside this, there was also Dark Shiva, Neo Shiva or Shiva Kai, Alpha Shiva, and a god-tier version of Shiva that even featured fish scales. Each could use Diamond Dust, except Dark Shiva, who could use an enhanced version called Diamond Ice. This would see the move applied 3 times, as opposed to once. MOBIUS featured a similar approach to Record Keeper, with numerous iterations of Shiva included to pay direct reference to past installments, such as Final Fantasy VII and X, but there were also some original versions of Shiva present too. Shiva was included at launch, and in her basic form was a water-based summon. Despite this association, Shiva was still described as the Queen of Frost, could use Blizzaga, and had a design that focused on shades of blue, with ice-based accessories clearly present. MOBIUS also featured Extreme Shiva and Extreme Shiva X, both of which had designs inspired by her appearance in Final Fantasy X. Neither used Diamond Dust though, but they instead used a move called Extreme Whiteout, another interesting nod to Final Fantasy XIV. In Brave Exvius, Shiva was made a bit more unique. Obtained after being defeated in the Lanzout Mountains, Shiva featured a lavish design that was built upon Type 0 and Explorers by featuring black clothing with gold trimmings and a huge metallic frame. Once acquired, players would gain access to an ice-based ally who could use a variety of spells including Sleep, but her main attack was Diamond Dust that would deal ice elemental damage to all enemies. Dissidia Arcade featured Shiva as one of the 7 available summons, and her design featured the classic colours of blue, green and purple, as well as a crown and metallic frame. Although her appearance was brief, there were a few interesting nods, as outside of her summoning ice shards that would bind enemies and using Diamond Dust as her finishing move, Shiva could also restore a party's bravery, which was a loose nod back to Final Fantasy XI, where she could be used to buff the party. Shiva then had a similar application when appearing in Opera Omnia, as she could be used to buff the party through Shiva's blessing and cast Diamond Dust.
What's this?
Well, look who's back.
World of Final Fantasy saw the relationship between Ifrit, Shiva and Ramuh brought back to the fore, as not only was she one of the 7 mighty Mirages, she also appeared as a member of the Motley Trio and had a traditional design that featured shades of blue, green and purple, and an ice crown. Due to her involvement in the story, Shiva could be fought as a boss, but could also be acquired as a Mirage, and once acquired, she would use Slow and Sleep, Resist Sleep, and also use Diamond Dust. Perhaps one of the more interesting aspects of World of Final Fantasy though was its variety, and it saw numerous iterations of Shiva appear, including the return of Baby Shiva, now known as Mishiva, and Chivalry, a male version of Shiva who served as the chief of the Shiva Justice Police, who could use Deep Freeze to deal ice damage and lower evasion. On top of that, there was also Shivarina and Shiva, who were transfigurations, and Shiva Ixion, who appeared as a modified version of the Shiva sisters from Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XV had a huge focus on summons, who were known as Astrals. They played a prominent role in the game's wider lore, and Shiva was amongst the 6 who were selected to appear. Known as the Goddess of Ice, Shiva had a fondness for humanity, and this led to a complicated relationship developing with Ifrit. But after Ifrit was slain by Bahamut and the Astral War concluded, Shiva fell into a slumber. Unlike other iterations, in this game Shiva was able to manifest in another form, the High Messenger known as Gentiana, and it would lead to her having 2 distinct appearances, with her main form being a monochrome icy blue, and Gentiana, whose colour palette was much more dark. When called upon, Gentiana would freeze the surrounding landscape and then transform into Shiva, where another deviation would take place, as in this version, Shiva could create copies of herself, and these copies would combine to initiate Diamond Dust. Due to her role in the story, Shiva was also the most powerful summon available for Noctis to call upon, a complete role reversal on almost every prior iteration, where Shiva would often be one of the weakest. The most recent iteration of Shiva was seen within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it served as a modern interpretation of the design from the original game. The colour palette was much the same, but it was now softer, and various pieces of armour and jewellery were layered over the top. To obtain Shiva, she would need to be bested in Chadley's VR simulator, and here we'd see a few moves brought in from the wider franchise outside of Diamond Dust. Heavenly Strike, for example, would see a block of ice fall from the sky, whereas Ice Skate would pay homage to Type 0. This move would inflict slow, and then there was Whiteout, first seen in Final Fantasy XIV, that would inflict sleep. Shiva would also summon Frost Familiars to aid in combat, a trait seen a few times before. Rounded out, it made for an interesting iteration of Shiva, and again showed how faithful the Final Fantasy VII Remake was to both the source material and to the wider franchise as a whole. And it will be interesting to see how much of that holds true for the appearance of Shiva in Final Fantasy XVI. To date, we know very little about this particular iteration outside of her visual style, which will have a strong focus on whites and blues, with a crown also present. There are also theories as to the connection with Shiva in the story, with some pointing to Jill Warwick as a potential candidate to be her dominant. And that actually has an interesting connection with Final Fantasy XI, as Jill Warwick was born in the Fallen North territories, and in Final Fantasy XI, Shiva died in the Northlands, but we'll have to wait and see how that plays out when we start to learn more. And with that brief look at Shiva from Final Fantasy XVI, we hope you've enjoyed this retrospective look at how she has appeared and subsequently evolved throughout the Final Fantasy franchise. We really hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you did, please feel free to throw us a like. We'd also love to hear what summon you'd like us to tackle next, so be sure to let us know in the comments below. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Eckham, Benjamin Snow and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.